Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, November 14th in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government. At this moment, the U.S. is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they are nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world? Not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran. The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the accelerating profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. That elite's concern for profits has meant that the center of attention for American foreign policy for more than a century has been Eurasia, the landmass from Eastern Europe to East Asia, not Europe or the Western Hemisphere. Since at least the open door policy of 1899, the U.S. government has been determined to prevent the economic integration of the combined continental landmass of Europe and Asia, under any power, Eastern or Western, for fear that it would hinder the economic exploitation of the region by the American 1%. That's what the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about, World War II, conquering their greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, as they called it. That's why the U.S. left Russia to defeat Hitler alone. Russia lost perhaps 27 million people in World War II. The U.S. lost perhaps 500,000 in all theaters. The bedrock of U.S. foreign policy today remains the containment of Eurasia and retarding its economic development. The American task is more difficult today than at any time since World War II, owing to the effective alliance between Russia and China, and their effective alliance with other states, notably Iran and Syria. That's what the 1,000 military bases the U.S. has around Russia are meant to contain. Russia has 15 bases outside its territory. China has 1. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country on either side. The situation was described in 1948 in a secret State Department memorandum by the liberal diplomat and historian George Kennan. Quote, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the people of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction." Close quote. That was the considered position of the United States in the years after the Second World War. From World War II up to today, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people to maintain that economic control of the world. President Obama was the first U.S. president in history to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. In the campaign, President Trump criticized the 8 wars Obama was conducting. Obama's war provocations against Russia and China, and Obama's drone assassinations, accurately called the greatest terrorist program in modern times. But once in office, Trump has adopted many of Obama's war policies. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, which began America's longest war. The founders of AWARE saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over Eurasian economic rivals from Germany to China. Ordinary Americans have paid for the vicious wars the U.S. has fought around the world in our generation, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph of the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations, notably Russia, China, Iran, and Syria. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, and stop the drone attacks, the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, and end the war provocations against Russia and China. 3, cut military spending by at least 50% and close the more than 800 U.S. military bases ringing Eurasia. Bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who have been sent into 3/4 of the world's countries. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. Revoke the Obama administration's trillion-dollar plan to update U.S. nuclear weapons and make them more usable. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by the pro-war U.S. political establishment. We'll try to give a better account tonight, and we'll start with Karen Aram on the European Union. Is that right?
Yes, Carl. Thank you. There's so much to discuss. We should be focused on Asia, on North Korea, the provocations against North Korea by the U.S. But I came across this article this morning that certainly raised my interest and concern. It's in the World Socialist website, which I turn to first thing in the morning. This is by Peter Schwartz, and the title is EU Member States Take Major Step Toward a European Army. And I wish I could paraphrase this, but I haven't had enough time to do that, so I'll simply read a few paragraphs first. The European Union has taken a major step toward developing the capacity to wage war in the future, independently of and, if necessary, against the United States. Foreign and defense ministers from 23 of the 28 EU member states signed a framework document on a common defense policy in Brussels on Monday. Along with Britain, which will leave the EU in 2019, only 4 smaller countries, Denmark, Ireland, Malta, and Portugal, did not sign onto the deal. However, they can do so at any time. Now, with the Agreement on Permanent Structured Cooperation, known as PESCO, P-E-S-C-O, the EU states committed themselves to close cooperation in the development and purchase of weapons and in making available troops and equipment for joint military interventions. PESCO is an ambitious, binding, and inclusive European legal framework for investment in the security and defense of the EU's territory and citizens, the document states. The key issue is to make Europe more efficient, capable of acting, and quicker, said a representative of the German Defense Ministry. Now, what this agreement actually signifies is an escalation of European militarism. It's the first of 20 conditions to which all parties must commit is a regular increase in military spending. At least 20% of this must be directed to the purchase of new weapons. For its part, the EU intends to contribute, and I'm not going to go into the details right now. What I do want to point out is that the driving forces behind PESCO are Germany and France. In recent months, Berlin, Paris, and Brussels have promoted the project by holding 6 workshops. French President Macron, in a speech delivered at the Sorbonne in September, declared, "By the beginning of the next decade, Europe must have a joint intervention force, a common defense budget, and a joint doctrine for action." German Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen said the signing of PESCO was a great day for Europe. The parties were taking a further step towards an army for Europe. German Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel described the agreement as historic. It was a major step towards independence and the strengthening of the EU's security and defense policy. He anticipated that PESCO would result in a major increase in military capabilities. Berlin and Paris and Brussels are seeking to portray EU military cooperation as complementary to, rather than at odds with, NATO. Make no mistake, this is about NATO and the U.S. The PESCO agreement itself states the strengthened military capacity of EU states will also be of use to NATO. No, they're saying that it will strengthen the European pillar and serve to answer repeated demands for stronger transatlantic burden sharing. I'm not going to read this nonsense because it is just that. It's nonsense. Basically, commentators are generally agreed that 2 key events have encouraged the implementation of long discussed but repeatedly frustrated plans for a European army. Well, the election of Donald Trump and Brexit. A first attempt to found a European defense community failed in 1954 in the face of French opposition. No further attempt was made for several decades. At the turn of the new century, efforts to establish closer military cooperation failed due to resistance from London, which, as Washington's closest ally, wanted to prevent the emergence of any alternative to NATO. Trump's America First policy has sharpened the tensions between the U.S. and Europe. U.S. policy in the Middle East and Southeast Asia is viewed in Berlin and Paris as an attack on their interest. And America, Europe, and China are fighting among themselves to influence in Africa. Only in the preparations for war with Russia are the European powers and the U.S. cooperating closely by way of NATO. But even here, there are tactical differences on how far the conflict should be pushed. At the same time, Brexit has removed the most important opponent of a European army from the EU. So the PESCO agreement does not mean that all of the conflicts within Europe have been overcome and that Germany and France will toe the same line from now on. Even prior to the agreement, sharp differences emerged. While Paris wanted to restrict the agreement to a small, exclusive group of states with large armies that could intervene decisively in a crisis situation, Berlin pressed for the broadest possible range of participants with a wide spectrum of tasks. Germany prevailed. Since unanimous decisions are required, decision-making will be difficult. But Berlin feared that the Eastern European states, which are increasingly dominated by nationalist and anti-EU sentiment, would align with the U.S. The huge hike in military spending connected with PESCO will exacerbate class tensions in Europe. The ruling elites are already responding to class tensions in every European country with a major buildup of the apparatus of state repression. This is encouraging right-wing and nationalist forces and tearing the EU apart. In the final analysis, the growing tensions between the U.S. and Europe are not simply the product of the extreme nationalist policies of the current occupant of the White House, as the World Socialist website wrote in June of 2007. The Perspective column titled The Great Unraveling, the crisis of the post-war geopolitical order. The column continued, Rather, the tensions are rooted in deep contradictions between the interests of the major imperialist powers, which twice in the last century led to world war. So the events surrounding Trump's trip to Europe reflect a crisis not only of American imperialism, but of the entire world capitalist system. None of Washington's rivals, neither the EU, despised at home for its austerity policies, nor the economically moribund right-wing regime in Japan, nor the post-Maoist capitalist oligarchy in China, offers a progressive alternative. Anyone who asserted that a coalition of these powers will emerge to stabilize world capitalism and block the emergence of large-scale trade war and military conflict would be placing heavy bets against history. The rearming of Europe confirms this, and only the construction of an international anti-war movement based on the working class and fighting for a socialist program and the overthrow of capitalism can avert the catastrophe of another world war. Now, I want to emphasize here that this is not about Trump, okay? Because this is a discussion that's been taking place for quite some time. And it has to do with U.S. Imperialism and aggression and other nations' interest, their fear of our being in control and taking over. And I remember discussing this, during our talk, I think his name is Jens Stoltenberger, if I'm not mistaken.
Stoltenberger.
Stoltenberger, yes. And I've forgotten what his title was, but I think he was head of the German Defense Department or something. And he was talking about a German national, or that each nation should have its own army, because NATO was not protecting anyone. NATO was there primarily for U.S. interest in containing Russia. And so it did make sense. And I remember when we had Michael Bai on our program, so this goes back 2 years ago, I think at least, who was a German national studying here. He pointed out that there was a concern by the German military and that they were trying to build up their military as a result of U.S. aggression. So this is something that's been coming now for a while, and it is frightening. It is definitely frightening. The more militarization that takes place, the more buildup. The one thing I didn't get from this article, Carl, was who are they going to buy their weapons from?
Yes, that's an important point.
I think that's a very important point.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you and I have often talked about China being thrown in there. I mean, yes, they're an oligarchy, but we have seen China with the Silk Road, or the BRI as they call it, as one positive step preventing war, because their whole focus is on business. And though they threaten the U.S. because we can't compete with them economically, they aren't about war. They don't want war. They want stability. They want to make money. They want to make everybody profitable. And they're offering this opportunity to other nations, even us, but of course we've refused to be involved. I don't know if anything transpired during Trump's meeting there. I'll leave that to you. But being that this is a socialist website, and so the goal is for international socialism, which I, as a socialist, I think that's, we just need to focus, I think, on our own nation and trying to bring about I think we need to focus on doing away with our capitalist system and not worry about what the other nations are doing just yet. We're not strong enough to focus on what we call international socialism. I mean, that's just my opinion, and I could be quite wrong. There are certainly many people who are better informed than I am who would disagree with me.
But that's why people from
Yeah.
local Democratic Front group call you a dirty trot, right?
Yes, yes. No, stupid trot, yes.
Stupid
right.
trot, sorry.
No,
Stupid
that's
trot.
not why. No, because he's a Democrat.
Yes, exactly.
He's just opposed to socialism. I think my concern is that there's too much of this we're supposed to be uniting with socialists around the world, and so we have some socialists who call themselves trots saying that we need to support the so-called socialist movements in Syria. And this bogs my mind completely, because what they're actually doing is playing into the hands of the U.S. government and the majority and the people that are actually supporting the ISIL and the jihadists there. So to me, they should not be calling for supporting a few people who may have started out rising up against their government, but they've probably been long gone, because if you really are truly a socialist, you're not going to want to see your own people slaughtered. And you're either going to be slaughtered yourself or you're going to join them, and then who cares? You're one of them. I mean, seriously, that's the way I view it.
You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was put together by the United States after the Second World War to deter the imminent descent of the Russian troops on Connecticut. That wasn't about to happen, but the Truman administration, realizing that only war production had brought the Depression to an end, had to find some way to get war production going again after the Second World War, when, of course, veterans wanted to go home or go to college or things like that. But American industry, particularly the American armaments industry, was necessary for the profits of the 1%. And therefore, as the senator from Minnesota, whose name is escaping me at the moment, advised Harry Truman, you have to scare hell out of the American people in order to get them to get up to the level of war production that would boost the economy as Second World War production had done. And of course, the way they did that was to invent the early form of Russiagate, the threat of Russia, then the Soviet Union, to descend upon the United States and wreak havoc on our country. And a generation or two generations of Americans were sold this lie, and the economic and military structure of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a lie from the beginning. The Russian army, which admittedly had won the Second World War, but had won it at such cost that by the end of the war, which cost the Russian people many more casualties than any other combatant. At the end of the war, the Russian army was exhausted, not surprisingly. The mechanized divisions of the Russian army in 1945 were pulled by horses. That was the tank divisions and so forth. Hey, look, the notion that Russia would challenge the United States for supremacy in Europe was a lie from the beginning, which the U.S. put abroad in order to control Europe. That was the real issue after the war. Who would control the European economy? What the United States really feared at the end of the Second World War was the attractions of socialism, as they had been developed in the first half of the 20th century, would catch the eye of the populations of Europe after the war, and that had to be stopped. Capitalism had to be restored, that is, the rule of the American corporations had to be restored in Europe, and Europe had to be reconstructed as workers and customers for American capitalism. That's what the Marshall Plan was all about. The Marshall Plan was an American investment scheme that would build up European business as a complement to American industry and corporate control. What we're seeing today, it's worthwhile to think about this history, which has been, as I say, remarkably misrepresented to literally generations of Americans. It's worthwhile to think about this because, in some sense, that arc of development of European economy under American tutelage, so to speak, is coming to an end today. The 30 glorious years, as the important economist Thomas Piketty calls it, from 1945 to 1975, has been followed by 30 years of American neoliberalism, which has been mainly an attempt to fight off the relative decline of the American economic empire. As the countries destroyed by the Second World War rebuilt in a generation, they got to the point of interfering with the hegemony, the economic hegemony of the American ruling class. I mentioned a few minutes ago the remarks of from the 1940s, the State Department policy planning staff about the U.S. having 50% of the world's wealth and 6.3% of the U.S. population. That was true in 1948. But by 1975, that 50% of the world's wealth had been reduced to 25% of the world's wealth. Still a substantial amount for what was not much more than 5% of the world's population in the U.S., and that was, of course, remarkably skewed into the hands of the 1%. But the situation was finally one of relative decline of American economic control in comparison with NATO. This is the background of Donald Trump's complaint in the last election campaign that Europe wasn't carrying its load. It wasn't bearing the weight of the defense of Europe. Well, the whole thing is nonsense from the beginning, because Europe has never needed defense from Harry Truman's days to our against a supposed Russian threat. There never has been a Russian threat. The closest we've come to a Russian threat was the development of nuclear weapons by the Soviet Union in imitation of the United States as a defense against the threat by the United States to use those nuclear weapons. The mutually assured destruction that grew out of the Second World War, out of the joint development of nuclear weapons, was always a defense and was recognized to be that by the rest of the world. Only in America were people told that the U.S. was in imminent danger of being attacked by a foreign power sporting nuclear weapons, namely the USSR, and therefore something had to be done, and we probably have to strike them first. This lie has been common in American politics throughout my lifetime, and it's nonsense. The fact that it's being revealed to more and more Americans as nonsense today is the background of things like Russiagate. The terrible fear of the American ascendancy is that Americans will find out what the real situation is, and that has to be stopped. You mentioned another point in this, Karen, that I think is worth mentioning, and that is the EU independent military being perhaps a boon to the arms industry. And that should never be discounted. This is a very important point. Reminded me, as a matter of fact, if I may indulge in a personal memory, as a kid, finding in my parents' library a book by a University of Chicago academic, a young academic, University of Chicago, whose name was Helmut Engelbrecht. The book was called Merchants of Death, and it had pictures, black and white pictures, The book was published in 1934, the year my mother graduated from college, as a matter of fact. I think it may have been her book, but in any case, it was an account of the arms industry in the First World War. Not by any means all American, by any means, it was more European and British, but the arms industry in the First World War as a contributor to that war. There's people who were making the weapons that would be blown up on the battlefields of Europe were obviously interested in selling their product. And the Merchants of Death, the subtitle of the book is a study of the international armament industry, gave an account of a book written in 1934 between the two wars of how the arms industry had contributed to the First World War. As I say, it was done by a young academic who clearly was going to have trouble with his academic career as a result of his political writings. It may have been worse than that. He died very young. In peculiar circumstances on a train ride from New York to Washington, and it's been suggested that that the circumstances were not innocent. Whether or not, it was one of the few American publications from the interwar years that talked about the responsibility of the arms industry for international war. So I think of The Merchants of Death and Helmut Engelbrecht, and the fact that as a kid I came across this book and said, you know, something doesn't ring true here.
Well, for those who don't care to go look up the book, I will. But for those who don't, there was a 2005 film, kind of a sleeper, starring Nicolas Cage, and the title was Lord of War. It was written, produced, and directed by Andrew Niccol. And I found it quite enlightening at the time because it deals with arms dealer, an American, and it deals with the arms industry. And it confronts the morality of people involved in this, and it shows how the proliferation of weapons across Africa, specifically to separate the various different tribes and to foment war. So even though, as I said, it's not a work of art, nonetheless, for those who did see it, it was an eye-opener at that time. I want to get back to something else. I don't know if I have enough time to read the whole article, which is worthwhile. This is also from the World Socialist website. That's what got me here this morning, these two articles that I read by Eddie Haywood. And the title is U.S. Carries Out 3 Drone Strikes in Somalia. Now, this has been somewhat reported, but I think it needs to be noted. The U.S. forces carried out 3 separate drone strikes across Somalia within less than 24 hours last weekend, underscoring the sharp escalation of Washington's military offensive in the Horn of Africa. Now, reportedly targeting the Somali Islamist militia al-Shabaab. The first strike occurred on Saturday in Garoud, which is some 250 miles southwest of the capital, Mogadishu. The second drone strike was executed in the early morning hours on Sunday in the lower Shabelle region, around 40 miles west of the capital. And the final drone strike came 6 hours later, hitting the northern Puntland region. I'm not going to even refer to the statements made by AFRICOM with our many military bases all across Africa, which we managed to put in there against most of the African nations' desires until we had President Obama going and visiting, and they embraced him as a brother, and he was able to accomplish what George Bush was not able to do. So now we are headed, okay, let me just expose this. As a lie, we want to expose a lie that AFRICOM's claim that drone strikes avoid civilian casualties, which is absurd.
That's what they're for, right?
That's what they're supposed to be for.
Exactly.
But the drone...
the civilian casualties are exactly what the drone strikes are designed to do. Well, the notion that they avoid is like saying I'm bombing the city in order to prevent it from being destroyed. Well, nonsense.
No, I attended a legal debate at the U of I Law School, and I was horrified because I had expected one of the debaters who I had seen online on YouTube at the Oxford Union, I believe it was, and opposing the morality of drone strikes. He came off rather weak at the U of I. But they're trying to give the impression that, yeah, it's targeted killing, so that makes it all right. We're targeting someone who's bad, okay, without jurisprudence, without due process of law, which the U.S. is supposed to follow, even with non-American nationals, okay, and against the Nuremberg, all of the Nuremberg and Geneva Convention, et cetera, or Nuremberg laws. I remember I did broach that, but it's a lie because they don't just target individuals, which is wrong in and of itself, which is my point, but drone strikes, actually, according to The Intercept in 2015, they compiled from classified documents leaked to the news agency, which document thousands of civilian deaths from drone strikes in the Middle East and Africa since 2009. So that's just in that 4-year period. The numbers cited in the documents are an estimate and are likely to be far higher. So underscoring Washington's callous disregard for civilian casualties, the source which provided the documents told The Intercept that the U.S. considers anyone caught in the vicinity of a drone strike is guilty by association. And that when a drone strike kills more than one person, there is no guarantee that those persons deserve their fate. So it's a phenomenal gamble. The drone strikes follow last month's double truck bomb attack in a central district in Mogadishu, which killed more than 350 people and injured 300 more. The Somalia Islamist militia Al-Shabaab has been blamed for the bombing, and Somalia's U.S.-backed government declared a state of war against the militia following the attack. But we know the U.S., since just the beginning of 2017, has carried out 26 drone missile attacks in Somalia. The missile strikes are a component of Washington's military escalation and expansion in the Horn of Africa with now here's something interesting, with Trump's announcement in March of efforts to rout Islamist militants belonging to Al-Shabaab, including the deployment of additional U.S. troops to Somalia. So underlining the dimension, sorry, that wasn't what I wanted to point out. It's all supposed to be targeting terrorists and actually killing terrorists, okay. But what it really is, now here they're claiming that, I just want to point this out, Trump has approved newly rewritten rules of engagement for the U.S. forces in Somalia. They're claiming then that they're saying that he actually revised the rules of engagement. But actually he didn't. They were revised in 2015 by the lawyers of the Pentagon. And I had a copy, we talked about it, and I know that as of January of this year, they've been trying to claim that Trump rewrote them. And that's nonsense, but he probably approved them just as he has approved the Pentagon going ahead and doing what they want to do. But here again, that's an inaccuracy here, and I actually will have proof next time I show up. But I want to point out what this is really all about. This is really all about the war in Somalia as the product of an over 20 years long effort by successive Democratic and Republican governments to secure a puppet regime in Mogadishu, a government which has no popular support anywhere in the country. And during the brutal course of its imperialist operations, Washington has completely devastated Somali society, leaving the Somali masses utterly impoverished, susceptible to disease, famine, and a lack of vital infrastructure. I'll stop there.
Raise the question about why the U.S. is interested in killing people in Somalia.
China.
Well, that's part of it. That's certainly part of it, as I say.
The resources.
to counter Chinese influence in Africa.
Right.
But Somalia has a particular interest in the United States. If you look at a map, for the U.S., Somalia counts as environs of the Middle East, environs of the Persian Gulf. It's part of American attempt to control oil flows from the Middle East, which, as we were saying earlier, has always been a part of the U.S. attempt to counter Eurasian economic development. We don't need the oil from the Middle East, but China does. And so long as we control the flows of oil from the Middle East, we have what the Pentagon calls offshore control of China. Offshore control means that we control the energy resources that get into China. Now, this whole matter has changed a good bit recently with the Chinese-Russian entente. Russia has oil, China needs oil, and the U.S. attempt to put a chokehold on how China gets oil comes to an end, or at least is greatly reduced by the Chinese-Russian understanding. But as a sidelight to this, the U.S. control of East Africa is part of that general control, that general offshore control, the control of the flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf. So in the old SDS motto, everything is connected, and that is the way American planners look at it. We make a mistake if we think that American planners are just sort of blundering about the world, fighting fires and spreading democracy. That's not true at all. American policy is quite conscious, quite intelligent, quite accurate, and quite evil.
I think,
Because the policy is a policy of maintaining the profits of the
Right.
American 1%.
yeah, and that's why, Carl, I think it is important to always emphasize, yes, it's about the oil. Yes, it's about the mineral resources. Yes, it's about the competition from China and Eurasia. And yes, it's about the sale of weapons. But most of all, it's a plan that has been in practice going back before World War II. And as you've often pointed out, I never get his name right, Alistair Mackinder pointed out
Alfred.
Alfred Mackinder.
Al Ford.
Al Ford Mackinder, okay.
He's a
Al.
Brit.
Let's call him Al. Yeah,
Al,
he's a
call him
Brit.
Al. You can call me Al. Right.
At in the late 1890s, I think it was, that Eurasia was, the prize. We always talk about the jewel in the crown being India for the UK, but the whole continent of Eurasia, specifically Asia, it was viewed as the crown for the U.S. As after World War II, when the UK, I guess, began to tumble. But you're a better expert on the history. But I think it's important for people to realize this, that it isn't just reaction, it isn't just this, it isn't just that, it isn't just one thing. It's been a plan all along, and it's proceeding, and it's geopolitical. So even if we didn't need their oil, even if we didn't need the mineral resources that Africa has to offer, we would still be doing exactly what we're doing now.
I think it is important, too, to understand how the American policy of killing people with drones came about and what, in fact, it does. Once again, this is something the rest of the world understands pretty well, but most Americans don't. There is a sense, a very strange sense, in which the drone attacks are an attempt to avoid casualties. Not obviously the casualties of the people who are killed by the drone strikes, but to avoid casualties to Americans.
Right, right.
The point of a drone strike
Yeah.
is that you don't have an airplane up there dropping bombs that could itself get into difficulties of one form or another and result in American casualties. American bombing has always been, going back to Vietnam, an attempt to save American soldiers in the sense of you're not risking American soldiers to kill people. You're killing people from 50,000 feet or, well, maybe not from 20,000 feet, and you're doing it with an airplane. The drone goes one better in the sense that you're now killing people from 20,000 feet, but there are no pilots in the planes. And this was an innovation of the Obama administration, and has been called the greatest terrorist campaign of the modern world. The Obama administration killed perhaps 5,000 civilians with its drone strikes over several years, and it instituted them in a way that was remarkably described in a New York Times feature that really, I think, had a different purpose. But what the New York Times described was what the Obama White House called Terror Tuesdays. Terror Tuesdays were the days that the head of the CIA, John Brennan, one of the torturers from the Bush administration, the head of the CIA would come to the White House with a list of people to be killed, people in foreign countries that the U.S. government decided needed to be dead because they were working against American interests. This has been called, in a very important book by Andrew Coburn, Kill Chain, this has been called the kingpin strategy. And he compares it to what the American war on drugs did for years, where the idea was that if you could get the head of the gang that was spreading drugs, then you therefore would change the distribution of drugs. Well, always a questionable procedure to begin with, and of course it involved murder, but the same thing was tried by the military in regard to the people we didn't like in the rest of the world, as the U.S. was busily trying to exercise its control over the rest of the world. The notion that taking out kingpins would be a good way to retard that opposition to American military control. But as you pointed out, the attempt to kill kingpins often resulted in the killing of a lot of other people who happen to be in the vicinity, as you say. And the Obama administration adopted this procedure because it didn't put American pilots at risk. But it did kill an awful lot of people who were not even targets of the terror campaign that the Obama administration is carrying on. What would happen would be that John Brennan would bring this list of people to be killed to the White House each Tuesday. Obama would sit down and go over the list, being told about who those people were that the CIA had picked out to kill, and then say yes or no on whether those people could be killed. He almost always said yes, and as a result, thousands of people died. This was the terror campaign of the Obama administration, and as far as we can tell, it's been essentially adopted by the Trump administration, the only difference being that it's not clear Trump sees the list. That the people to be killed are chosen by the CIA and the Pentagon in the same way the Obama administration did, but that doesn't even have the casual approval that Obama insisted on. The policy hasn't changed, and the dead people continue to pile up. I once had a fantasy that it would be interesting for the president to see all the corpses that he had produced by drone strikes piled on the lawn of the White House, and wondered whether that would make any difference in terms of what the American government does.
Carl, something else you have mentioned many times about the turnaround of the Vietnam War being when the U.S. soldiers revolted against their superiors. Now, I honestly didn't see that at the time, even though I did work in an anti-war capacity with several vets, but I think they didn't go around advertising it at the time. But I just learned recently, well, I've known it, but it just came to me, that the Bolshevik Revolution was supported for several reasons. Why did they support Lenin? It's been pointed out by several that, of course, Lenin was a very strong leader. They were the anti-war party at the time, before they took power. And after World War I, people Russians especially, were fed up with war. But because the military specifically supported the Bolsheviks, they completely revolted against the military leadership because they had had it and they saw what was happening. Now, there's been a lot of talk about this. I can't come up with any details, but this came up on Crosstalk. Mark Sloboda, who is an American former military analyst, was making a very serious point that it was the military that supported the Bolsheviks because they had had it. So I'm thinking that that's
in the First World War.
Right. And that's why they supported the Bolsheviks. But I'm thinking to myself, and when you have the support of the military, that was it. Then that was why the Bolsheviks won initially. Okay. So I'm thinking that this is probably more thinking on the part of the Pentagon, and one of the reasons we've been using contractors and mercenaries and drones, because there is fear of a revolt from the military. They're the first pillar, and this has happened in the past. This has happened many times in the past. So you're the historian, you can probably quote all the times it happened, but I'm wondering if that's one of the reasons.
Well, the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution has actually produced some reflection on the politics of those days and the politics between then and now. That may indeed be worthwhile, particularly since, almost accidentally, the notion of socialism has been reintroduced into American politics just in the last couple of years. So, yeah, it's a discussion that should go on. I think for the last part of our program today, we will present a talk from a number of years ago by Noam Chomsky on Lenin, Trotsky, and socialism in the USSR. So this is an appropriate lead-in to it. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 46th week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. You can see No's notes for October on the blog News from Neptune, and soon his notes from November. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scholarly. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware for articles we referred to tonight. There's also a link to Aware's anti-war teach-in on YouTube, produced by Karen Aram and prepared for TV by the omnicompetent Jason Liggett. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Not presented by them, I'm afraid. This is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Burrough, good night and good luck.
Hi. Well, let me begin with two recent events, both of them widely publicized. The first has to do with the famous Salman Rushdie case. A couple of days ago, you may have noticed, the Prime Minister of Iran suggested a very simple way to resolve the crisis concerning Rushdie. He suggested that what should happen is that all the copies of his book, Satanic Verses, should simply be burned. And I guess the implication is that if that happened, then they could cancel the death sentence. That's one case, lots of coverage. Second case had to do with an interesting thing that happened here. There was what some people are calling a mega merger of two media giants, Time Incorporated and Warner Communications Incorporated, each of them huge conglomerates, and coming together, they formed apparently the world's biggest media empire. Now that also had a lot of publicity, even outside the business pages, and there was concern over the effects of the merger by increasing media concentration so effectively, the effects on freedom of expression. Well, these two events they seem rather remote from one another, and in a sense they are, but we can draw them together by recalling an event which was not considered important enough to be reported, but which I happen to know about because I was personally involved. The title for this talk is, you may have noticed, Manufacturing Consent, Political Economy of the Mass Media. That's actually the title of a recent book that I was co-author of with my co-author is Edward Herman. And the two of us have been working together for many years. Our first book was published in 1974, a book on American foreign policy and the media, in fact, and it was published by a publisher, a textbook publisher, flourishing textbook publisher, which happened to be a subsidiary of Warner Communications Incorporated. Well, unless you're a very rare person, you never saw that book, and the reason was that when the advertising for the book appeared after 20,000 copies were published, one of the executives of Warner Communications saw the advertising and didn't like the feel of it and asked to see the book and liked it even less, in fact was appalled, and then followed an interaction which I won't bother describing, but the end result of it was that the parent company, Warner Communications, simply decided to put the publisher out of business and to end the whole story that way. Now, they didn't burn the books. They pulp them, which is more civilized. Also, books don't burn very well, actually, I'm told. They're kind of like bricks. But pulping works. And it wasn't just our book that was eliminated. It was all the books published by that publisher. Well, there are a couple of differences between this and the case of the Prime Minister of Iran. One difference is that this was actually done, not just suggested. The second difference is it wasn't just one book. It was all books which happened to be tainted by being published by the publisher who had done this bad thing. A third difference is the reaction. The reaction in the case of the Warner Communications putting the publisher out of business to prevent them from publishing our book, the reaction to that was zero, not because it wasn't known, it just was not considered of any significance, whereas the Rushdie affair, of course, has had a huge furor, as it should, and the Prime Minister's proposal was greeted with ridicule and contempt as a demonstration of what you can expect from these barbarous people. So there are some differences. Well, let's go back to the question about the mega merger. Will this new media empire restrict freedom of expression by excessive media concentration? Possibly, but the marginal difference is slight, given what already exists, as is perhaps illustrated by this case. This is incidentally not the only case, far from the only case, which illustrates how hypocritical and cynical the reaction to the Rushdie affair is. The reaction is legitimate, but we can ask the question whether it's principled or not. And if we look, I think we find that it's not. Well, actually, this whole story that I've just told is kind of misleading. It's accurate in identifying the locus of decision-making power, not only in publishing and in the media, but in political life and in social life generally. In that respect, it's accurate. But it's very misleading with regard to how that power is typically exercised. This is a very unusual case. I wouldn't want to suggest that this is what happens typically. It's usually much more subtle than this, but no less effective. And now I'm going to come back to some of the more subtle ways and the reasons for them. And in fact, if there's time, or maybe back in discussion, I'll talk about the aftermath of this particular incident, which is also kind of illuminating in this respect, though more complex. Well, with that much as background, let me turn to the main topic, manufacturing consent, a topic, and thought control and indoctrination and so on. Now, and I want to discuss how this relates to the media. Now, there is a standard view about the media and the way they function. The standard view is expressed, for example, by Supreme Court Justice Powell when he describes what he calls the crucial role of the media in affecting the societal purpose of the First Amendment, that is, enabling the public to assert meaningful control over the political process. So the idea is this is kind of an instrumental defense of the First Amendment. The value to be achieved is the democratic process, and for the democratic process to function, it's necessary for the public to have free access, open access to relevant information and opinion, and a wide range of opinion, and it's the job of the media to ensure that, and the First Amendment has the instrumental function of guaranteeing that this is served, and the media then do it. That's the standard view. And notice it has a kind of a descriptive component and also a normative component. It says this is what the media ought to be like, and this is what they are like. Now, that they ought to be this way seems sort of obvious, in fact, kind of almost tautological. If democracy has something to do with the public having a capacity to shape their own affairs, it obviously presupposes information, and that means the information system in a free society would have to serve this function. Since it seems so obvious, it's worth bearing in mind that there is a contrary view, and in fact the contrary view is very widely held. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the contrary view is the dominant view among people over the last couple of centuries who have thought about liberal democracy and freedom and how it ought to function. In any event, it's certainly a major position. This contrary view can be traced back to the origins of modern democracy in the 17th century English Revolution, when for the first time there was a challenge to the right of authority whether it was the gentry or the king or whatever. And there was actually the beginnings of a real radical democratic movement with a commitment on the part of the people involved, who were very widespread in England, to public involvement and control over affairs. They didn't want to be ruled by the king, and they didn't want to be ruled by Parliament. They wanted to run their own affairs. And they were defeated. The radical Democrats were defeated, but not before doing some important things which had a lasting effect. Well, what I'm interested now is the reaction to this. The reaction to the first efforts at popular democracy, radical democracy you might call it, were a good deal of fear and concern. One historian of the time, Clement Walker, warned that these guys who were putting out pamphlets on their little printing presses and distributing them and agitating in the army and telling people how the system really worked, were having an extremely dangerous effect. They were revealing the mysteries of government. And he said, that's dangerous.